cockpit. The pilot has to fly the plane, maneuver it in all kinds of ways, and be shooting the two machine guns at the same time, and hoped that the synchronization of shooting always happened between the blades of the propeller and not shooting off the blades of the propeller. Unfortunately, these guns were known to get jammed on a frequent basis and added to the challenge of being a pursuit pilot. They also had to dress for the weather. These were open cockpits. So you can see, this is not Fred, but an idea of how they dress, these great big heavy gloves, as well as a hat and goggles in the open air cockpit. This is what happened to a lot of planes that were used, both the Newport 28s as well as others. This is Frank Luke, who was with the 27th Squadron. He was one of the squadron's ace pilots, meaning he shot down 5 aircraft or more. But even he sometimes had tangles, and his mechanics were less than pleased when he had them recover the pieces and parts of that machine. They went on to Epee in April 24th and joined up with the 3 other squadrons that would make up the first pursuit group. From there, in May, they went near Toul, on June 1, they were formally organized as the first pursuit group. And here are the 4 insignias. The 27th Aero Squad was the American Eagle. They called it the Screaming Eagle. The 147th was the Rat Terrier. Their motto was, "Who said rats?" The 94th, which was Eddie Rickenbacker's squadron, had the hat and the ring insignia, and the 95th was the Kicking Mule. This is Fred Norton with his fellow pilots pausing at their barracks in Toul, looking at a design for their Screaming Eagle insignia. Again, you see the Screaming Eagle on the side of a Newport 28. Here is Fred with a Newport 28 at Toul. I think he's an incredibly handsome young man. He grew the little mustache, perhaps to make him look particularly leader-like. Life of pilots at the flying field was interesting. They had a surprising amount of social life, including dinners and dances with American nurses and YMCA girls in attendance. Dave's question is, did Norton ever meet up with his high school classmate Frances Jordan, who was a nurse during World War II in France? We know that Frances, who later married Dr. Leroy Belt of Lakeside, well known in this area, was in France, but didn't meet her husband there. We don't know if she ever met Fred, and it's possible that their paths never crossed. The off-duty life of pilots in France, again, they were unlike typical Army officers because between combat flights, they could take motorcycles and automobiles and drive into town, and they could even fly their own planes. Each one was assigned a plane, and they could fly to Paris. They had afternoon or evening off, and enjoy the life in Paris, including the good food and plenty of booze. Whether or not Fred indulged, we have no idea, but it was certainly available. Continuing on into the summer now, on June 2nd, they actually entered combat operations. The first patrol, they were, according to the diary notes from Zenos Miller, they were a little disappointed because there were no Germans in the air. They were they were excited to begin their chase of the Huns, but nothing on that first day. They began a routine where there would be 3 scheduled patrols that lasted 1 to 2 hours on a rotating basis, and then 3 or 4 voluntary patrols every day. So at most, a group, and it could be 3 to 6 pilots, would each take off in the air with their own planes and fly together as a group looking for German aircraft. They did that actually on a scheduled basis 3 times a day. Then pilots could go up if they wanted to. It was all very interesting. They would just get a few buddies together and say, oh, let's go up at 2 o'clock this afternoon if the weather's good. And off they would take, searching for German planes. On June 4th, they actually went up 7 times it was starting to heat up in the area where they were, and they had a number of German observation photographers who were up in planes. That's what the observation squadrons did, is they took professional photographers up with them, and they had to fly low enough and over enemy territory so the photographers could get pictures to take back to the base. So there were a number of those German photographers up on June 4th, and the 27th Squadron's job was to go out and hassle them. On June 13th, the first one of the pilots with the 27th went missing after he was shot down and later reported to be a prisoner. They continued that same type of patrols through the end of June, when they received instructions to go on to Chateau Thierry. This is Norton with the 27th dog. Most of the squadrons and groups had dogs, mascots. This was a little black bull terrier. He belonged to another pilot, and then that pilot was killed. And so he had asked Norty, as he was called, N-O-R-T-I-E, to take over responsibility for the dog. Lining up for takeoff. Photograph of the area where the 27th concentrated its efforts, there along the Marne River. Let's see, Dave, do you want to talk about this? You want me to continue? Okay. Now they've moved to Tonquin, a little closer to the action, June 28th. And they, again, staggering their patrols throughout the day, trying to become familiar with this new sector. You know, you're flying your plane, you're looking down, trying to figure out, you know, what are the geographic features of the landscape, where is the enemy. And each day they would try going deeper into enemy territory, running the risk of anti-aircraft artillery fire from the ground. But they still had not had much encounter with German aircraft in the air. On July 2nd, they were engaged in combat with the famous Richthofen Circus. 8 planes were in combat for 35 minutes, and 4 enemy Fokkers were shot down, but the squadron also lost 2 pilots on that day. 2 of the 8 went down. Through mid-July, the 27th carried out escort patrols for the observation aircraft from a couple of the other squadrons. Each squadron had been assigned a particular task for all of its pilots. Oftentimes, these photographic observation aircraft were balloons, not necessarily other airplanes, but there would be these balloons flying through the air. Now, the advantage was they were quiet, but of course they were big and couldn't go very fast. So balloons were certainly good targets for being shot down. Here's again a picture of Fred standing next to his Newport 28. He had been assigned number 7 with his ground crew. So we know those who knew the bases could identify that this was taken at Tonquin because of the particular kind of hangar there behind them. The mechanics, there were typically 4 mechanics assigned to each pilot, and they were a team. They didn't rotate. It was their responsibility to work very closely with that pilot to keep the plane in tip-top running order. And again, as I mentioned, there were problems with the guns jamming and the engines missing. So as a pilot, your best friends were the 4 mechanics on your team to keep your plane in tip-top condition. This is what a stripped-down Newport 28 looks like. So you can see all of the parts and pieces that were necessary to create something that would maintain itself in the air. One of the advantages that the enemy pilot had was that they were assigned parachutes. So they could save their lives by jumping out of a plane that had sustained significant bombing damage. I asked Dave why the French, British, and American flyers were never assigned parachutes, because they obviously were available if the Germans were using them. And Dave's response, when he looked at me, he said, because they didn't want the pilots bailing out. You had to stay with your plane and try to bring that plane down because it was so valuable. And they were already losing lots of them. We're now heading into July. The Allies are concentrating on attacking the German infantry formations. A very full Allied offensive began the middle of July, with operations going on from dawn until nightfall. It was a very challenging situation for everyone. And on July 15th, the 27th encountered German formations that could be as large as 30 aircraft. So it really was a dogfight in the air. The Germans crossed the Marne on July 16th, but the Americans held the line. The 27th continued escort flights for photo reconnaissance in terms of helping headquarters know where the enemy was. On July 20th, Fred Norton's luck ran out. After supper, he and 4 other pilots flew off in search of German planes after they'd already had an active day. Lots of activity in the air, lots of planes being shot at. Unfortunately, a big storm arose, and it made it difficult for them to get back to the base in a timely manner. While coming back to the base, these 5 pilots encountered 20 enemy planes, and a prolonged fight ensued. Unfortunately, Norton was shot in the chest. He was able to get his plane down on the Allied side of the line, but he was taken to a hospital, and the squadron was not notified that he was at this particular hospital. There are a couple of sources that say that There was a delay in getting him to the hospital from the field because of the incredible amount of ground vehicle traffic on the roads, trying to get supplies in to the Allies with all this activity going on, and for whether it was that or just his exposure on the field until rescue got to him, but he contracted pneumonia and died 3 days after the battle at the hospital. That was a French hospital. This was the headline on August 17th when his parents received word that he had died on July 23rd. Now think about that. Your son dies on July 23rd in a French hospital, and you don't receive notice of it until you get a telegram on August the 17th. Again, because Norton had been such a star in athletics at Ohio State, it made the front page. His commanding officer was Major Harold Hartney, and he wrote a letter